What if the terrifying stories you've heard weren't just fiction? Imagine a chilling moment in the dead of night, when the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur, when your deepest fears come to life. The following is a collection of disturbing true stories, each more unnerving than the last, where strange whispers, eerie reflections, and unexplained disappearances leave an indelible mark on the soul. These are the kind of stories that will make you question everything. Are you ready to face the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of your awareness? It's time to listen, but beware. The truth is far more terrifying than fiction. At some point in our lives, we all encounter moments that make us question what's real and what's not. Whether it's the soft whisper of something unseen, the feeling of being watched when no one is around, or the unexplainable events that happen when the lights go out, these things stay with us, etched in the back of our minds. But what happens when these things aren't just figments of imagination? This collection of disturbing, true, scary stories dives into the terrifying accounts that have plagued real people. Stories that will make your skin crawl and leave you wondering if your own nightmares are closer than you think. From the unsettling presence of a woman in the hallway of a hospital, to a chilling reflection that wasn't quite your own, to the whispers in the woods that promise to keep your secrets forever. These aren't the kind of stories you hear around a campfire. They're the kind that haunt you long after the tale ends. Every one of these experiences is tied to an undeniable truth. Something real happened. Something that can't be explained away, no matter how much you try to rationalize it. You'll meet individuals who have come face to face with the unknown and lived to tell their stories, but not without a lingering sense of dread that will never leave them. Ready to hear the stories that will leave you looking over your shoulder in the dark? Take a deep breath and proceed with caution. These stories are more than just fiction. They're the true, unsettling events that should never have happened, but did. Story number 1. It was late October when Sarah and Dan Parker found themselves standing in the dim glow of a dying afternoon, surveying their new home in rural Wisconsin. The house, a small, weather-worn Victorian, had stood for decades on a quiet street lined with ancient oaks. It was the kind of place you'd walk past without a second thought, dusty and forgotten, as if time itself had given up on it. The walls were thick with age, and the house groaned under the weight of its years. Sarah wasn't sure she'd been entirely sold on the idea of moving here. There was something about the place, something unsettling. But Dan had fallen in love with it, and after the move, she had to admit, the charm of the place grew on her. There were plenty of things to fix, though, especially the bedrooms. Their daughter, Emily, had already started complaining about the wallpaper, its peeling surface barely hanging on, the faded pattern of roses now almost unrecognizable. It was Emily's room that became the first project. Dan, with his usual enthusiasm, had taken to the job that afternoon while Sarah busied herself with the unpacking. "Help me with this, will you?" Dan called from the next room. Sarah followed the sound of his voice, her feet dragging along the creaky floorboards. Dan was standing in front of the window, the faint light of sunset casting long shadows in the room. He was pulling at the edges of the wallpaper, peeling back the layers of old paper with a determined force. "You should have seen how thick the wallpaper was in here," he said, grinning. "I think it's been on these walls for, 50 years." The sound of tearing paper filled the air, sharp and satisfying. But then, something strange stopped Sarah in her tracks. Beneath the wallpaper, what she saw made her stomach tighten. The plaster wasn't bare. There were faces, childlike, faces drawn directly into the wall beneath the layers. They were crude, yet impossibly detailed. Eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, all painted in shades of gray and red. The faces were scattered, as though they had been hastily etched into the surface, as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. "Dan, what is this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Dan's smile faded. He stepped closer, studying the strange faces, his brow furrowed. "That's not normal," he muttered, his voice trailing off. He reached up to touch one of the faces, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed against the rough plaster. The eyes seemed to follow him, even in the dim light. "They didn't say anything about this when we bought the place," Sarah said, her voice thin, as though she were trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the light. Just a strange, harmless design left behind by the previous owners. The old woman, Mrs. Fitzhugh, had been the one who'd sold them the house. She had been strange, an odd mix of sweetness and something darker beneath the surface. The last time Sarah had seen her, before the papers were signed, the old woman had warned them with an unsettling smile. "The house keeps things. Keeps things." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, but she couldn't make sense of them. She shook it off, trying to focus on the task at hand. "Let's just finish this," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's probably just an old decoration or something." But Dan didn't seem convinced. He stepped back and looked at the faces again, his eyes scanning each one. They seemed to stare back, unblinking. That night, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed, the girl was unusually quiet. Emily, at 7 years old, had always been full of energy, constantly talking, asking questions, even at bedtime. But tonight, her eyes were wide, her hands gripping the sheets tightly. "Is something wrong, sweetie?" Sarah asked, brushing Emily's hair back. Emily didn't answer at first. Then, in a soft, frightened whisper, she said, "There are voices in my room. Whispers. I don't like them." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Whispers?" she asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. Emily nodded, her eyes darting nervously to the corner of the room where shadows gathered in the fading light. "They come when I close my eyes. They're saying things." "Sweetie, it's probably just the house settling," Sarah said, trying to reassure her. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. For the next few nights, the whispers continued. Sometimes they were faint, like distant murmurs. Other times they were loud, as if they were right beside her. Emily would wake up, her eyes wide with fear, but no one else could hear them. Sarah tried to convince herself it was just the new house settling, but the unease lingered. Then, one morning, Sarah went to wake Emily for breakfast, and the room was empty. There was no sign of her daughter, no sign of a struggle. Just a quiet, empty bed, the sheets untouched. Sarah screamed for Dan, but there was no answer. It was as though Emily had simply disappeared into thin air. The police came, scouring the house, the woods, the surrounding fields, but they found nothing. Emily was gone. Days passed in a haze of grief and confusion. No one could explain what had happened. The only thing that remained was a new face in the wall. This one was different from the others. It was fresh, its edges still raw and smeared with a dark red stain. The face wept, tears streaking down from its eyes as though the plaster itself was crying for what had been taken. Dan moved out within weeks, unable to stay in the house after what had happened. Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. she stayed, trapped in the silence, haunted by the whispering walls and the faces that watched from the plaster. She often wondered, when the house kept things, what exactly had it kept from her? Story number 2. It was late autumn when George Winthrop, a traveling salesman, checked into the old hotel on the outskirts of Denver. The place was hardly more than a shadow of what it must have once been. Faded carpet, peeling wallpaper, and a flickering neon sign that did little to disguise the sagging structure. The smell of old wood and mildew clung to the air like an aftertaste, but it was cheap, and that was all George cared about. The hotel clerk, a thin man with a nervous twitch, handed over the key to room 217 with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll be fine, Mr. Winthrop," he said, his voice high and jittery. "It's a quiet place, not many guests this time of year." George took the key, muttered a polite thanks, and made his way upstairs. The hallways seemed too long, too quiet, like something was holding its breath just out of view. Room 217 was at the far end of the corridor, tucked away from the rest. George didn't think much of it at the time. He just wanted to get to bed, tired from the long drive and the endless series of dull sales pitches that had drained him. That night, after a sparse dinner of canned soup from a vending machine, George sank into the bed, the springs creaking beneath him as he tried to relax. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a sharp knock on the door. 3 heavy thuds. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the kind of knocking that would be made by an unexpected visitor or a room service cart. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was waiting for him. George sat up in bed, the room faintly illuminated by the streetlights outside. His heart began to thud in his chest. He checked the time. It was exactly 3:17 a.m. He swallowed the lump in his throat and waited. The knocking came again. 3 slow, steady knocks. Knock, knock, knock. George hesitated, but curiosity and fear drove him to the door. He opened it a crack just enough to peer into the dark hallway, but there was no one there, only the faint hum of the old lights overhead, flickering now and then. He stood there for a moment, listening, but the silence returned. Thinking it was his mind playing tricks, he closed the door and locked it. But sleep didn't come easily. His eyes kept drifting to the clock, and the knocking, though no longer audible, lingered in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. The next night, it happened again. Exactly 3:17 a.m. The knocking began. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. Knock, knock, knock. George groaned and pulled the covers over his head, willing himself to ignore it. But it didn't stop. His heart raced, his palms began to sweat. He couldn't stand it any longer. This time, he flung the door open, desperate for whatever silence would come after. The hallway was empty, cold, dead quiet. But something wasn't right. George's eyes fell to the door, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A dark stain on the door frame just under the handle. It was wet, like something had pressed against it recently. He reached out with trembling fingers and touched it. The stain was warm, too warm. He pulled his hand away and looked at his fingers. The wetness was red, like blood. His stomach churned. He wiped his hand on his pants and stepped back, his mind racing to understand what was happening. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it. Beneath the smear of red, written in what looked like bruised, raised skin, was a name. his name. George Winthrop. The words were scrawled, twisted, and raw, as though they had been carved into the wood itself. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it. It was as if the door was calling him. No, claiming him. His mind whirled. He couldn't think. The knocking, the stain, the name, it all felt like a terrible dream, something he should be able to wake up from. But the clock on the wall said 3:17. George stepped back, his legs weak, and the hallway felt like it was closing in on him. The temperature had dropped and he could see his breath. The silence stretched on, and then, from somewhere far down the corridor, he heard it again. The knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Not on his door this time, but somewhere in the darkness. George slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands shaking violently. He backed into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The knock was still there, but this time it was different. Louder, more frantic. A fourth knock, and then a fifth. And then the knocking began again, but it wasn't at the door. It was from inside the room. Knock, knock, knock. George couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his bag, his shoes, anything he could carry. He threw open the window and scrambled out onto the fire escape. The cold night air stung his face, but he didn't stop to think. He just ran. The next morning, the manager found the door to room 217 standing open, its knob cold to the touch. He entered cautiously as though he'd expected it. Inside, there was no sign of George. Nothing was out of place except for the faintest, lingering smell of dampness and something else. Something metallic. The doorframe still bore the faint, wet handprint, but the name had faded. Only the bruised indentations of the letters remained. A memory of something, or someone, who had been there, and then disappeared. The manager only sighed as though this were a part of the hotel's strange history. No one stays long in that room, he muttered under his breath, locking the door behind him. No one stays long at all. Story number 3. It was a warm summer night in Illinois, the kind where the air felt thick with heat and the streetlights buzzed faintly in the distance. A group of teenagers, restless and full of that anxious energy that comes with being young, gathered on the outskirts of the city near an old drainage tunnel. The tunnel had always been a local legend, a forgotten relic of the city's old water system, dark and decaying beneath the streets. Nobody talked about it much, but everyone knew about it. And that, of course, made it the perfect place for a dare. There were 5 of them. Jake, the quiet one who always tagged along, Ryan, the leader, quick with a smile and a challenge, Mia, and Emily, 2 friends who'd been inseparable since middle school, and Carter, the joker, the one who always seemed to have something sarcastic to say. They stood at the entrance of the tunnel, a gaping black hole that seemed to swallow up the last rays of the dying sun. Who's going in? Ryan grinned, his teeth bright in the fading light. Mia hesitated, looking at the dark tunnel, but Emily nudged her forward. Come on, it's just a tunnel. What's the worst that could happen? Yeah, Carter added, leaning against a crumbling brick wall. It's not like there's anything in there. Maybe a few rats. And who knows? You might find treasure. They all laughed, though the sound felt strange in the thickening air. Ryan stepped forward, his voice lowering. All right, I'll go first. Then you all follow. No turning back. The others exchanged glances, a mix of hesitation and bravado. After a beat, they followed, one by one, squeezing into the tunnel's narrow entrance. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint, unpleasant smell of rot. The walls were slick with moss, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The farther they went, the darker it became, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. Jake shivered. "It's colder in here than I thought." "Yeah," Ryan muttered. "It's like the air is thick." They trudged on, their feet echoing in the oppressive quiet, until the tunnel widened, and the light from their flashlights flickered against the walls. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like it was too quiet, as if the city's noise, its heartbeat, had been shut out completely. Then it happened. It was subtle at first. A feeling, a weight in the air, like something was watching them. Jake stopped, his flashlight wavering in his hand. "What's wrong?" Mia asked, looking over at him. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice shaky. "It feels weird, like something's here." They all paused, listening. At first, there was only the sound of their own breathing, the echo of their footsteps. But then, a faint sound, so soft they almost missed it, whispered through the tunnel. A low, barely audible rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. Ryan furrowed his brow. "What was that?" "I don't know, but it's coming from behind us," Carter said, his voice tight. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder. The smell of rot, that sickly, decaying stench, thickened. Ryan shone his flashlight behind him, but there was nothing there, just darkness, thick and suffocating. Then they felt it, a cold, clammy pressure against their ankles, like fingers gripping at their skin, pulling them down. Ryan was the first to react. He jerked his leg back, his foot slipping against the wet stone. "What the hell?" he hissed. Mia screamed, the flashlight slipping from her hand as something icy brushed past her leg. Carter tried to pull away, but it felt like something was tugging him forward, dragging him deeper into the tunnel. "It's got me! It's got me!" Carter shouted, his voice rising in panic. But no one could see anything. Not in the dark, not with their own terror taking hold. Then another hand, another grip, cold and wet, clasping around their ankles, tightening, pulling. The sound of their panic grew louder. Footsteps slamming against the tunnel floor, heartbeats echoing through the cold air. Ryan turned, desperation in his eyes, and sprinted toward the exit, pulling Mia and Emily with him, while Jake and Carter struggled behind. They reached the mouth of the tunnel, gasping for air, stumbling out into the moonlight. But when they stopped and turned around, Jake was missing. "Where's Jake?" Emily gasped, her voice cracking. Ryan's heart sank. He glanced at the others, fear sinking its claws deeper into his chest. "He was right behind me. He was right there." They called his name, but there was no answer, just the faintest echo of their voices bouncing back from the darkness of the tunnel. It was empty now. There was no sign of Jake, only the sound of the wind rustling the trees above them. The tunnel loomed in the distance like some hungry, waiting mouth, but there was no more movement, no more sound. Ryan felt a chill crawl down his spine. Then, faintly, almost lost in the rush of wind, they heard it, a soft, wet laugh. Low and gurgling, as if someone was drowning in the tunnel. It was Jake's voice, his laugh, but twisted, warped in a way that made Ryan's blood freeze. The sound lingered, a dark, unsettling reminder that the tunnel had taken something, taken someone, and that it would take again. They ran. They didn't look back, and when they reached the safety of the streetlights, they swore they'd never speak of what had happened, what they'd felt, what they'd heard. But as they walked away, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with them, something that followed in the shadows, whispering at their heels. and deep beneath the city, in the choking blackness of the tunnel, Jake's laugh echoed softly still. Story number 4. It was just after 2 a.m. when Claire Reynolds first heard it. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the soft crackle of the baby monitor, the usual static that came with the night. But then, from the speaker, a voice drifted through the silence. Her own voice, clear and soft, calling her baby's name. Emma. Claire's heart thudded in her chest. She froze, listening. The voice wasn't distorted by the usual hiss of the monitor. It was calm, too calm, and it was unmistakably hers. Emma? She shook her head, certain she'd misheard it. She had to have. She turned toward the crib in the corner of the room, the shadows of the nursery stretching across the floor, her daughter's small, peaceful figure nestled beneath the blanket. Emma had been asleep for hours. Claire hadn't heard her stir, but there it was again. The voice. Clearer now. Emma. The hairs on the back of Claire's neck stood up. She rushed to the crib, a quick, sudden movement only to find Emma still sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Claire stared at her baby for a moment, then glanced back at the monitor. The screen was still glowing faintly, a soft green hue that illuminated the dark room. She held her breath, straining to listen. Nothing. The monitor was silent now. Only the rhythmic sound of Emma's breathing filled the room. Claire exhaled, trying to calm her racing heart. It must have been the static. She was overreacting. But the next night, it happened again. At exactly 2 a.m., her name, her own voice called out from the monitor. Emma. It wasn't a trick of the static. It was too clear, too deliberate. This time, Claire didn't even look at Emma. She was already on edge, her pulse quickening. Her first instinct was to check the monitor to make sure it wasn't malfunctioning. She pressed the button to turn the volume up. The voice came through again, soft and chilling, yet unmistakably hers. Emma. The room felt colder now, as if something had slipped into the nursery with them. Something that didn't belong. Claire felt the air grow heavy. She wanted to reach for the monitor, to turn it off, but her hands were frozen, her body rooted to the spot. But then she heard it, the faint sound of her daughter crying from the crib. Soft, tiny sobs. They grew, louder with each second, filling the room, breaking the silence. Claire rushed to Emma, scooping her up into her arms, trying to soothe her. Emma's cries were weak and desperate, like she had been terrified, like something had frightened her in the dark. But the baby's eyes, when Claire looked down at her, were wide open, glassy and unblinking. Emma stared at her with a strange emptiness in her gaze, as though something had taken the life from her. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She stayed awake in the rocking chair by the crib, holding Emma close, too afraid to put her down. The baby monitor was still on, but it was silent. Yet the air in the room felt wrong, thick with an unspoken presence. The next night, Claire set up the security cameras. She'd read about people who'd experienced strange things in their homes, unexplained noises, figures appearing in the background of their footage, and though she was still skeptical, the voice on the monitor had shaken her deeply. She hooked up the cameras to her phone, watching the live feed on the screen. The house was quiet, the shadows stretching across the hallway, the moonlight casting faint glows on the walls. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the sound came again, soft at first, just like before. Emma. It was, her voice unmistakably. But this time, Claire's eyes were glued to the feed. She saw the nursery door creak open, slow and eerie, as if moved by a hand that wasn't there. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted unnaturally, and for the briefest moment Claire thought she saw something. Something pale and indistinct leaning over Emma's crib. Its shape was barely discernible, but its presence was undeniable. The figure's lips moved, but there was no sound from the feed except static, a low, gurgling moan that vibrated in Claire's ears. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was enough to make her stomach lurch. The baby's cries began again, louder now, desperate, as if the figure was hurting her. But Emma, still in the crib, was silent, her eyes staring blankly. Unblinking, Claire screamed, the sound tearing from her throat as she leaped from the chair and rushed to the nursery. But when she burst through the door, the room was empty. The crib was empty. Emma was gone. The monitor still crackled in the corner, the faint echo of her name lingering in the air. Claire's heart raced as she ran to the camera feed, but there was no sign of the figure. Nothing but the dim, empty nursery. Desperate, she ran through the house, checking every room, searching for her daughter. But she couldn't find Emma. She couldn't find any trace of her. By dawn, Claire was frantic, almost wild with fear. The police were called, but they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Emma had simply vanished. Claire and her husband fled the house, unable to bear the crushing weight of its emptiness. The house sat quiet, the baby monitor still transmitting, the soft static echoing in the corners of the dark nursery. And in the distance, if you listened closely enough, you might hear a faint whisper, a voice calling out distorted and far away. Emma, and it would go on forever. Story number 5. David Langston had never been one to believe in ghosts. He wasn't one to jump at shadows or whisper nervously about strange noises. But all that changed during his time in St. Margaret's Hospital, the place that would prove to be both his salvation and his terror. It was late October when David was admitted after a routine surgery took a turn for the worse. He found himself stuck in a dim, sterile hospital room, isolated from the world as his body fought to recover. The recovery was slow, agonizing. Pain was his constant companion, and the bright hospital lights seemed to beat down on him even when the sun was long gone. It was during those long nights, the quiet ones when the world outside seemed to sleep, that he first saw her. At exactly midnight, David would always wake to the sound of distant footsteps, soft, echoing across the hall. At first, he thought it was just the usual late-night nurses making their rounds, their shoes tapping rhythmically against the hospital's old tile floors. But then, one night, the footsteps changed. The sound became slower, quieter, almost too smooth, like someone gliding, barely touching the ground. It was subtle at first, something that could easily be dismissed if you weren't paying close attention. But David was. He had nothing else to do but listen to the silence of the halls, his body aching in the stillness of the night. He tried to ignore it. It was probably just his mind playing tricks on him, the medication affecting his senses. But the sound persisted. And then, in the shadow of the hallway just beyond his door, he saw her, a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, a pale blue dress, a starched white apron, and a cap perched delicately on her head. Her face was obscured by the dim light, but David could see her outline clearly enough. She moved, slowly down the hallway, gliding like a shadow, her feet never seeming to touch the ground. She didn't make a sound. The way she moved, so silently, so fluidly, was unsettling. She didn't look back as she passed David's room. His heart pounded in his chest. A nurse? Yes, but not one he had ever seen before. "Excuse me," David called weakly, his voice hoarse, but there was no response. The woman simply continued on, her movements graceful, as if she didn't even notice him watching. Curiosity gnawed at him. He struggled to sit up, ignoring the sharp pangs in his abdomen, and tried to follow her. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor making his bare feet ache. His hospital gown shifted uncomfortably as he stumbled toward the door. The hallway stretched out before him, empty now, save for the dim light that flickered from above. No sign of the woman. But then he heard it again. The soft, gliding footsteps leading toward the end of the hall. He followed. His breath quickened as he limped down the corridor, the shadow of the woman always just out of reach. His footsteps echoed too loudly, but still she never turned, never seemed to hear him. She reached the fire door at the end of the hall, the one that was always locked. Without a sound, she vanished through it, disappearing into the darkness beyond. David reached the door, his hand shaking as he grabbed the cold metal handle. It was locked, as always. He pressed his ear against it, but there was only silence on the other side. He stood there, bewildered, staring at the door as if it might open on its own, revealing the mystery behind the woman's sudden disappearance. Next morning, David tried to tell the nurse at the desk. He didn't know why, but he felt an urgent need to explain what he had seen, to make sense of it. "I saw a woman last night," David said, his voice cracking. "A nurse. She was dressed in an old uniform." The nurse didn't look up from her chart, her face expressionless. "It's probably just the medication," she said dismissively. "Some patients see things during their recovery. Hallucinations, you know." David wanted to argue, to tell her it wasn't a hallucination, but he kept quiet. She didn't seem to care. The days passed. The woman didn't return, but the uneasy feeling stayed with him, lingering in the corners of his mind. He tried to forget about it, to chalk it up to stress and exhaustion. But at night, when the silence stretched long and heavy, he still found himself listening for the sound of those soft footsteps. It wasn't until months later, after he had been discharged and was recovering at home, that David stumbled across a photograph in an old forgotten book in his living room. It was an old black and white picture, faded with time, of a hospital staff from the 1930s. In the front row stood a woman in a nurse's uniform. David froze when he saw her face. It was the same woman he had seen in the hallway. Her eyes were haunting in the photograph, staring back at him from a time long past. The caption beneath the photo read, "Nurse Margaret Ellis, St. Margaret's Hospital, 1934. Died in the hospital after a long illness. Tragic loss." The shock of recognition hit David like a wave. It was the woman, the nurse from the hallway. He read the caption again. Margaret Ellis had died in the hospital, in that very hallway. The woman he had seen was no figment of his imagination. She had been real, and as David's heart sank with the realization, he remembered something else the nurse had said. The one who had brushed off his concerns about the hallucinations. "Every patient who has seen her hasn't survived their illness." David shuddered, the weight of those words settling heavily in his chest. He didn't know why or how, but it was clear now. The woman he had seen was no ordinary nurse. She had been part of the hospital's past, a part of it, forever tied to the halls of St. Margaret's, and every patient who had seen her had died before they could fully recover. David hadn't died from his illness, not yet, but the fear that gripped him now, the knowledge that his encounter with the woman had been a warning, clung to him like a second skin. He had survived, so far, but something deep inside him told him that the hospital's shadow still followed him, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of reason. And Margaret Ellis, the nurse from another time, still waited, still glided silently through the halls of St. Margaret's, her presence lingering, like a whispered promise of what was yet to come. Story number 6. Lena Park had always found something a little comforting about the quiet, almost forgotten corners of her childhood home. The old house in Pennsylvania, tucked away at the edge of a sleepy town, had been in her family for generations. It creaked in the way old houses do, settling into its bones as the night pressed in around it. Her parents were out, as usual, somewhere, leaving her to her own devices. She was 17, and she had that typical teenage boredom, where every hour felt like it stretched on forever, a nothingness you couldn't quite escape. It was the kind of afternoon where the sky hung heavy with clouds, and the house felt too still, too silent. So, like any girl her age, she turned to her phone. It had started as a simple, silly thing, taking a selfie in the bathroom mirror. The soft, filtered light from the old frosted glass light fixture cast her reflection in a pale glow. She smiled at herself, the same smile she'd used 100 times before for photos. She took the shot, checked the screen, but there was something wrong. In the photo, her reflection wasn't just smiling, it was grinning. A wide, knowing smile. But Lena hadn't moved, not an inch. Her lips had stayed still, the way they always did when she posed for a photo. She stared at the image on her screen, confused. She hadn't done anything different, but there it was, the reflection. Her own face, but twisted, too wide, too sinister, like a grin stretched too far, too fast. Her heartbeat quickened. It had to be a trick of the light or the camera or something. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She deleted the photo, set her phone down on the counter, and tried to push it from her mind. But it lingered, that strange smile, that odd feeling, the unease creeping through her chest. Days passed, and the sensation didn't fade. The mirror became an object of anxiety, one she avoided whenever she could. But every time she walked past it, she would catch a glimpse, just a flicker, a shadow that didn't belong. The way the light seemed to change around it. How it seemed to reflect things that weren't there, or things that shouldn't be there. Lena started to notice something else. Her reflection wasn't in sync with her anymore. At first, it was subtle. She'd raise a hand, and the reflection would take a split second longer to follow. A second longer. Like the mirror was holding her in place, waiting. But that wasn't the worst of it. One night, after a particularly long day of school, she stood in front of the mirror again. She stared at her reflection, willing herself to stop feeling paranoid, to stop imagining things. But then, her reflection winked. Slowly, deliberately, like it was its own separate entity. The real Lena's heart skipped a beat. She stared, wide-eyed, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't moved. She hadn't even thought of blinking, but the reflection had. She backed away, stumbling out of the bathroom. That night, she stayed in her room, phone in hand, unable to let go of the image that kept flashing through her mind, her reflection, alive. A few nights later, Lena's parents came home from work later than usual. They found the house unusually quiet. No TV, no music, not even the sound of Lena's footsteps from upstairs. When they called her name, they were met with silence. "Lena?" her father called again, his voice laced with concern. Still nothing. He found it odd how quiet everything was. As he climbed the stairs, he found his daughter's door ajar. The bathroom light was on. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the empty bathroom. But the mirror was different. Cracks had begun to form, spidering across the surface. They were thin, faint at first, but unmistakable. A network of fractures, sharp and jagged, bisecting her reflection into fragmented pieces. Her father's breath caught in his throat. And then, just as he was about to call out again, something stopped him. Something at the corner of the mirror. A handprint. But not from the outside. This was different. It was pressed into the glass from the other side. The imprints still glowing, faintly in the dim light. It was small, delicate, like a child's hand. But it wasn't hers. Her mother stepped forward, her face pale as she looked at the cracks. "Lena," she whispered, stepping cautiously toward the mirror. Her voice was laced with fear now. But there was no answer. In that moment, they both realized Lena was gone. There was no sign of her, no sound, no movement. The house was eerily still, save for the crackling silence that filled the space between them. Lena had vanished. The only evidence of her remained in the bathroom. The reflection, the one that wasn't hers, stared back at them from the cracked mirror. The handprint pressed into the glass, the fingerprints almost too distinct, too defined, and somewhere deep inside the house, just beyond the walls, in the darkest part of their hearts, both parents knew. The reflection had taken Lena. The house stood empty after that night, still and quiet. It was as if time had forgotten it. The bathroom mirror, cracked and dark, still hung in place. And though no one dared to go near it, sometimes if you stood close enough you could still see it. The reflection that wasn't hers. Waiting, smiling, grinning, always waiting and never quite gone. Story number 7. It was a place that no one dared to speak of at Millfield boarding school. The teachers rarely mentioned it, and when they did, it was always in passing, as if they were trying to forget. It was room 117, tucked away in an old, forgotten wing of the school. The door was always locked, always bolted from the inside, and the key was never found. The older boys whispered stories of it, stories that mixed fear with curiosity. Some claimed to have heard strange noises through the walls. Others said they'd seen shadows moving behind the door, but no one really knew what was inside. That was why Charlie, Matthew, Luke, and Peter found themselves standing outside room 117 one chilly October evening. They'd heard the rumors, of course, and after weeks of daring each other, it had become too much to resist. A dare was a dare. The bravado of youth had taken over, and now they were determined to get a glimpse inside. The four of them stood in the dim hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The school was quiet, too quiet, like it had forgotten them. Or perhaps they had forgotten it, consumed by their own childish excitement. The air felt thick, almost heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Ready?" Charlie whispered, his hand already resting on the cold metal of the door handle. He had always been the leader, the one who pushed them into these things. Luke, the smallest and most nervous, hesitated. "I don't know about this, guys," Luke said, his voice trembling slightly. "What if we get caught?" Matthew, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "Come on, Luke. Stop being such a baby. It's just an old room, probably full of dust and junk." But Peter, who had always been the joker of the group, stepped forward with a grin. "You chicken. Don't worry. We'll be out in 5 minutes. We'll be legends for getting in there." Charlie grinned, confident. He twisted the door handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. A gust of stale air rushed out from the dark room, thick with the smell of mildew and dust. It wasn't just the air that felt stagnant. There was something about the room that seemed frozen in time, a place that had been abandoned long ago, yet not forgotten. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind them. Dust covered every surface, thick and undisturbed. The furniture was old, the once red velvet upholstery now a faded pinkish brown. But it wasn't the furniture that caught their attention. It was the circle of small, colorful toys arranged in the middle of the room. They were scattered in a perfect circle, toys that seemed to have been placed there with care. A small chipped doll, a wooden toy car, a teddy bear missing an eye. Each toy looked worn, old, but it was the way they were arranged, as if they had been waiting. Luke shivered. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Peter stepped closer to the toys, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Looks like someone was playing here a long time ago." Matthew kicked at the floor, breaking the silence. "Let's get this over with." As they stepped deeper into the room, they felt the temperature drop, the chill creeping into their bones. The dust on the floor was thick, but there was something strange about it. Small, faint footprints, child-sized, circled the toys in the same pattern. The prints were too perfect, too deliberate, as if someone very small had been walking in tight circles around the toys for hours. The sight made Charlie's stomach turn. Peter laughed nervously. "Okay, I don't like this anymore. Let's go." But when they turned to leave, the door wouldn't budge. Charlie grabbed the handle again, yanking at it, but it was stuck fast, as though the door had sealed itself behind them. They all tried, each one pulling and pushing with more desperation, but nothing worked. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if something was pushing back, keeping them inside. And then, the sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the distance, a giggle, high-pitched, childlike. It echoed off the walls, but it didn't sound like a child's laugh. It was too low, too wrong. The giggle turned into a soft, rhythmic clatter, the sound of something small and hard bouncing on the floor. The boys stood frozen, their breath shallow. Matthew spoke first, his voice shaky. "What is that?" The clattering continued, soft and rhythmic, like tiny toys being knocked across the floor. The sound grew louder, closer, and that's when they saw it. From the corner of their eyes, they could make out a shadow moving, no, shifting across the room. It wasn't just a shadow. It was like something was there, but not there, lingering just at the edge of their vision, taking shape and then vanishing again. Luke screamed, a high-pitched, panicked noise that broke the stillness. I want to get out, now." Charlie, his heart pounding in his chest, yanked at the door once again. This time, it gave way, the wood groaning as the door creaked open. They stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The darkness of the room seemed to press in on them, lingering even as the door slammed shut behind them. The boys didn't speak as they hurried back to their dorms, the events of the night hanging over them like a cloud. They didn't want to talk about what they'd seen, what they'd heard, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that something had been watching them from the locked room. Days passed, and the terror of that night began to fade into the background. But Peter, the prankster, the one who had insisted on the dare, didn't come back to school after that week. At first, they thought he was sick, maybe too shaken to return. But after a few days, it became clear that something was very wrong. He didn't show up. No phone calls, no letters. Peter just vanished. The rumors started, as they always did in places like Millfield. Some said he'd been expelled. Others whispered that he'd been sent home for medical reasons. But the truth was, no one ever saw him again. The boys never spoke of the locked room again. The school continued on, as it always did, its halls emptying and filling with new faces each year. But there were always whispers about room 117. And if you asked the right people, they'd tell you the same thing. If you hear the giggling, if you hear the toys clattering, you should run. You should never go near the locked room. Because whatever is in there, whatever was in there, is still waiting. And once it has you, it doesn't let go. And the next time you go near that door, it might not open at all. Story number 8. It was late on a Tuesday evening in Seattle when Sarah Collins left her office. The city felt strangely empty, quieter than usual, the kind of night where even the city streets seemed to hold their breath. The rain had just stopped, leaving the sidewalks slick and glistening under the streetlights, their reflections shimmering like ghosts in the puddles. Sarah wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, quickening her pace as she made her way down 4th Avenue. She didn't mind the walk home. It was only about 10 minutes, and she usually enjoyed the solitude. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with a tension she couldn't place. She didn't notice him at first. He blended in with the shadows, a tall figure in the distance, a man who seemed to be walking at the same pace as she was. But after a few blocks, she realized he was always there, always just behind her, keeping his distance, yet never falling behind or passing her. His presence felt like a dark weight pressing on her shoulders. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Just another person on the same street, someone walking home like she was. But then, she caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of a storefront window. He was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. His face was obscured by the darkness, but the moment she saw his smile, she froze. It was wide, too wide, stretching across his face in a way that was almost wrong. The grin seemed to widen with each passing step, like he was enjoying some private joke, something she wasn't a part of. He wasn't looking at her, not exactly, but she could feel his eyes on her, even from behind. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She sped up, glancing over her shoulder again. He was still there, not closer, but not farther away either. Just there, always grinning. Panic began to settle in her stomach, a cold, gnawing sensation that wouldn't let go. She ducked into a nearby bar, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft chime, and she pressed herself against the cool wood of the bar counter. The bartender glanced up, offering her a quiet smile. "You all right?" "Yeah, I think I'm being followed," Sarah said, her voice trembling a little more than she wanted it to. He didn't seem surprised. "It happens sometimes," he said, pouring a drink for another customer. "Some people get odd around here. You want to call someone?" She nodded, pulling her phone out of her bag and dialing her best friend, Emma. The phone rang, and finally, Emma picked up. "Hello?" "Emma," Sarah breathed. I need you to talk to me. I think there's someone outside. A man. He's been following me for the last 15 minutes. I don't know what to do." Emma's voice was sharp with concern. "Sarah, where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm at the bar on 4th Avenue. I'm just going to stay here for a bit. I don't know what's going on, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." She stayed in the bar for hours. The man didn't move. He never got closer, but she could feel him out there, his presence pressing against the walls of the bar like a shadow. When she finally left, she made sure to keep her head down, trying not to meet his gaze, afraid of what might happen if she did. The night passed, and the man remained a fleeting thought, a ghost that would only resurface in the darker corners of her mind. But years later, after she'd moved across the country to California, something happened that brought that night back in a rush. It was a quiet evening in her new apartment, the sun having just set, leaving the room bathed in a soft, golden light. Sarah stood by her window staring out at the skyline when she saw him again. He was standing across the street, his face half hidden in the shadows, just like before. His figure was tall and thin, too thin, his long arms hanging at his sides. And then she saw it, the grin. The same wide, disturbing smile stretched across his face. No mistake. It was him. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The smile hadn't changed. It was the same one that haunted her dreams, the same grin that had never left her thoughts. Sarah stumbled back from the window, her breath coming fast and shallow. She grabbed her phone, fingers shaking, and dialed 911. When the operator answered, she could barely speak. "There's someone outside my window," she gasped. "A man. He's smiling at me. I don't know what to do." The police arrived within minutes. They checked the building, the street, even the alleyways behind her apartment. But when they spoke to her, their faces were empty of reassurance. "There's no one here, ma'am," the officer said, looking at her with a strange mix of concern and doubt. "Are you sure you saw someone? We've checked the area. No one matching your description exists." Her mind reeled. It didn't make sense. She had seen him. She had seen him so clearly, so unmistakably. The officer handed her a business card. "If you see him again, let us know. But until then, we'll keep an eye on things." Sarah spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring out the window, her hands trembling. But the man was gone. He hadn't been there at all, had he? Her reflection in the glass was all she saw, her pale face staring back, her eyes wide with fear. The next morning, she tried to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light, a shadow in the dark, but she knew better. The same smile, the same figure. He had been there. And somehow, despite the years and the miles between them, he was still following her. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, he was always there, just outside, of her reach. Always smiling, always waiting, and in the silence of her apartment she realized something terrifying. He would never stop. Story number 9. When Mark and Julie purchased the Victorian house in New Orleans, they were drawn to its beauty, the tall windows, the sweeping ironwork on the balcony, and the charm of the old neighborhood. It was everything they had ever dreamed of. They were young, eager to start a new chapter in their lives, and the house, with all its creaks and quirks, felt like the perfect place to build a future. The house had been empty for years. The former owner, an elderly woman, had passed away, and the place had sat neglected, gathering dust, waiting. It wasn't a complete wreck, but it needed work. A lot of work. Julie, an artist, and Mark, a contractor, figured they could handle it. They were used to getting their hands dirty. They started with the attic, the biggest project in the house. The floorboards were warped, and the air in the small room was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. But there was potential. Once they cleared out the old furniture and boxes, they planned to turn it into a studio space for Julie, a place where she could paint and create. It was late one afternoon when they were painting the walls, the attic filled with the smell of fresh paint and the hum of the radio playing softly. The room was getting brighter as the daylight streamed in through the small window. That's when Mark noticed it. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a smudge on the ceiling, but when he looked closer, his stomach tightened. A child's handprint. It was small, about the size of a young child's hand, but it was unmistakable. The handprint was smeared with dark red, almost black streaks, and the edges seemed to blur into the pale ceiling. It was strange, unnerving, as if someone had pressed their hand against the ceiling and then left it there, frozen in time. "Julie," Mark called out, his voice strained, a little too sharp. She turned, wiping her hands on a rag. "What's wrong?" "You need to see this," he said, his face pale. Julie walked over and looked up, following his gaze. The blood-stained handprint was still there, stark against the peeling white ceiling. Julie's eyes widened. "What the hell?" she muttered under her breath. They both stared at it for a long moment. The house was old, older than they had thought. But this was different. This didn't feel like a stain from years of wear and tear. It felt wrong. Mark tried to reason it away. Maybe it's just some old residue from the past owners. Maybe a leaky pipe or something, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them. Julie grabbed a stepladder. "Let's clean it up," she said, though her voice didn't sound as confident as usual. She climbed up, grabbing a cloth and some water, but when she wiped at the ceiling, the handprint didn't budge. It stayed, perfectly intact. She scrubbed harder, using a scrub brush, but the red streaks only seemed to deepen, as if the ceiling itself was absorbing the blood, as if the handprint were becoming part of the house. "That's impossible," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. They tried again, painting over the handprint with layer after layer of fresh white paint. They covered it, thinking that would be the end of it. But by morning, the handprint had reappeared, seeping through the layers of paint, darker, more defined than before. The blood seemed fresher, as if it had never been covered up at all. Julie stood in the middle of the room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's like it's alive or something." Mark's eyes were fixed on the print. He knew something was wrong, something deeper than they could understand. But what could they do? It was their dream house, the place they had worked so hard to create together. They couldn't leave, could they? Over the next few days, they tried everything. More coats of paint, cleaning solutions, sandpaper. But each time they returned to the attic, the handprint was waiting, its outline sharper, the blood darker, as though mocking their attempts. The attic began to feel oppressive, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on them. It wasn't just the handprint anymore, it was the whole house. The house was changing them. Julie began to feel strange in the evenings, a heaviness in her chest as though something was watching her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was angry, resentful even, as if it were holding on to something that refused to let go. One night, as they stood in the attic, staring up at the ceiling once again, Mark swore he saw movement in the handprint. Not real movement, but a shifting of the shadows within it, as if the print was breathing, pulsing. He rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, it was the same. Julie saw it too, her breath catching in her throat. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "I don't know what this is anymore, Mark," she whispered. "This is beyond what we can fix." They spent another sleepless night in the house, but by morning, something had changed. The weight in the air had grown heavier, more suffocating. It was as though the house had been waiting for them to leave, and now it was finally getting what it wanted. By dusk that evening, they made the decision. They couldn't stay. Whatever was in that house, whatever was tied to the handprint, had taken hold of them. They packed up their things, leaving behind the dream they had worked so hard for. As they drove away from the house for the last time, they looked back at it through the rearview mirror. The windows were dark, and the house seemed to stare back at them, silent and still. The handprint remained, perfectly visible against the fading light of the setting sun. From the street, anyone who passed by could see it, right there on the ceiling of the attic. The blood-stained handprint, perfectly preserved, staring out into the world. No matter how many layers of paint or coats of fresh plaster, it never disappeared. The house sat empty after they left, and as the years went by, the story of the handprint became just another whispered legend in the neighborhood, a warning for anyone who dared to enter. And though the house was abandoned, if you stood on the street at dusk, you might still see it, that handprint there on the ceiling of the attic, waiting for someone else to try and make it disappear. Story number 10. It was a warm summer evening at Camp Ashwood, a small secluded camp nestled deep in the forests of Vermont. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing as the children gathered around the campfire. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the earthy scent of damp leaves. The light flickered, growing dimmer as the last of the daylight faded into twilight. The counselors had told them to be quiet, to listen to the night. But the children, always restless and eager for adventure, began to talk in hushed voices. They were on the edge of the woods, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The darkness of the forest was close, too close, and the sound of the fire crackling in the silence only made it feel more alive. It started as a game, one of those games that was born from the half-whispered stories of the older campers. Things they spoke of in passing to make the younger ones shiver. It was called the Whisper Game, and the rules were simple. One by one, each child would whisper a secret to the forest, to the trees, to the darkness beyond the firelight. A secret so deep, so dark, that it would make the woods listen, make them keep it. At first, the secrets were innocent. A few whispered about losing a pet or the time they were caught sneaking candy. Others spoke of minor childhood fears, things they were embarrassed to admit aloud. The air grew thick with the weight of each whispered word, the forest silent, waiting. But then there was Jonah. Jonah was the quiet one. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was with a deep, unsettling seriousness that made others uneasy. He was the kind of boy who seemed to be always watching, always listening, his dark eyes taking in everything. He'd been at the camp for 2 years now, and while the other children liked him, they also kept their distance. There was something about Jonah, something that set him apart. When it was his turn, the group grew silent, waiting for him to speak. The flames of the campfire flickered and popped as if in anticipation. Jonah stood near the edge of the circle, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees. His hands hung by his sides, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke. "I saw someone die. Last year." The words hung in the air like a cloud. The other children shifted uncomfortably, not sure if Jonah was playing the game like the rest of them or if he was speaking some twisted truth. They had expected secrets of childish mischief, not this. Jonah's voice didn't waver. He didn't seem to care about the strange looks he was receiving. His eyes remained locked on the forest, his voice low as he continued. "I saw him by the lake." His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't breathing. The trees, they saw it too. They heard it. The other children were quiet now, no one daring to speak. Jonah's words echoed in the still air, filling the space between them like a heavy fog. The campfire crackled, but it sounded far away, almost muffled. For a moment, Jonah seemed to hesitate as though deciding how much more he should share. "I didn't tell anyone," he said finally, his voice tight. "I promised I wouldn't." The wind rustled through the trees, a strange, almost knowing sound, like the forest itself was listening, waiting. Jonah lowered his head and then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "The trees answered. They promised to keep it as long as I stay with them." The words didn't make sense at first, but something in the air shifted, something subtle and chilling, as though the ground beneath them had shifted without them noticing. Jonah turned and began to walk toward the lake. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he was in a trance. The other children watched him, unsure whether to follow or to call out to him, but none of them moved. They simply watched as Jonah disappeared into the twilight, his figure slowly, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. By the time the counselors arrived to check on the children, Jonah was gone. The night passed uneventfully, the children trying to sleep but haunted by the strange, unsettling events of the evening. The air seemed colder, the darkness thicker than usual. They heard the wind outside their cabins, but it was different this time. Too cold, too still. The next morning, when the counselors went to wake the campers, they found the camp eerily quiet. Jonah was not in his cabin, and his belongings were gone. At first, they assumed he had left for an early walk, but as the hours passed, they began to search the camp. Jonah was nowhere to be found. They scoured the woods, the lake, the trails that wound through the forest, but there was no sign of him. There was no trace, no footprints in the dirt, no disturbance in the leaves. It was as though he had never been there at all. Days passed, and the search grew frantic. The camp was filled with whispers, rumors, and quiet fear. But there was no sign of Jonah. Weeks later, when the camp season ended and the children had gone home, the counselors still spoke of him, though they said very little about the game and the secret Jonah had whispered. His disappearance was ruled as a mystery, something that no one could explain. But the children knew. They knew what had happened even if they didn't understand it completely. They had heard the trees whisper back. They had felt it in the air, in the silence after Jonah's words. That night by the lake, the darkness had answered, and Jonah had gone to stay with them. Years later, when the new summer campers played the same whisper game, some of them swore they could hear something moving in the trees, whispers in the wind, a voice calling from the darkness, promising secrets that would never be told, promises that would keep them in the forest forever. And if you listened closely, really closely, you might hear it. A soft, distant whisper saying, "I stayed with them. If these stories left you feeling uneasy, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you felt the chills creep up your spine, and don't forget to subscribe for more disturbing true stories that will make your nights darker than you ever imagined. What do you think? Are these stories real, or just the twisted product of fear and imagination? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to share this with anyone who loves a good scare. But don't say we didn't warn you. The truth can sometimes be far scarier than fiction.